Welcome to Adam's Scary Stories. If you enjoyed the darkness, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, because what you're about to hear might just keep you up at night. When I was 10 years old, my family moved into a high-rise apartment building in downtown. It was a big change from our suburban house, but I was excited about living so high up. We were on the 14th floor, and the view from our windows was incredible. The building was old, probably from the 1960s, with that distinctly retro feel that some people find charming, but that always made me feel slightly uneasy. The elevator was one of those old-fashioned ones with brass buttons and wood paneling, the kind that made creaking noises as it moved between floors and sometimes shuddered to a stop. There were 2 elevators in the building, but one was frequently out of order, so most residents used the main elevator on the left side of the lobby. At first, I loved riding the elevator. There was something thrilling about watching the floor numbers light up as we ascended, feeling that slight drop in your stomach as the car came to a stop. I would sometimes ride it up and down just for fun, especially on rainy days when I couldn't play outside. But after we'd been living there for about a month, I started noticing strange things about the elevator's behavior. Sometimes it would stop at floors where no one had pressed the button. The doors would open, revealing an empty hallway, and after a few seconds they would close again and the elevator would continue on its way. I mentioned this to my dad, and he said old elevators sometimes had electrical issues that caused them to make unscheduled stops. He said it was nothing to worry about, just a quirk of living in an older building. But something about those empty hallways glimpsed through the opening doors made me feel cold and uncomfortable. The building had 15 floors, with apartments on floors 2 through 14 and common areas like the laundry room and storage on the first floor and basement. The 15th floor was supposed to be mechanical equipment only, heating and air conditioning systems, electrical panels, that sort of thing. Tenants weren't supposed to have access to it, and there wasn't even a button for the 15th floor in the elevator. Or at least there wasn't supposed to be. The first time I saw the 15th floor button, I was riding the elevator up to our apartment after school. I had pressed the button for the 14th floor as usual, but as the elevator began to rise, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. There, between the button for the 14th floor and the emergency stop button, was another button I had never seen before. It was slightly different from the others, a little smaller, and instead of having a number, it was marked with a symbol that looked like an upside-down triangle. I stared at it for the entire ride up, wondering if it had always been there and I had somehow never noticed it. But I rode that elevator every day, sometimes multiple times a day, and I was certain I would have seen an extra button. When the elevator reached the 14th floor and the doors opened, I hesitated for a moment, thinking about pressing the mystery button to see what would happen. But something about it felt wrong, dangerous even, so I got off and went to our apartment. That evening at dinner, I asked my parents if they had ever noticed a 15th floor button in the elevator. They both looked at me strangely and said there were only 14 floors of apartments in the building. The next day, I looked for the button again, but it wasn't there. The elevator panel looked exactly as it always had, with buttons for floors 1 through 14, plus the basement, emergency stop, and alarm. I started to think I had imagined it, or maybe seen the shadow of something else and mistaken it for a button. But 3 days later, it was back. This time, I wasn't alone in the elevator. Mrs. Patterson from the 8th floor was riding up with me, carrying her groceries. I glanced at the button panel and saw the upside-down triangle button clearly, sitting right where I had seen it before. I looked at Mrs. Patterson to see if she had noticed it, but she was staring straight ahead, apparently oblivious. "Mrs. Patterson," I said carefully, "do you see anything unusual about the elevator buttons?" She looked at the panel and shook her head. "No, dear. Everything looks normal to me." I pointed directly at the mystery button. "What about that one?" She followed my finger and looked exactly where I was pointing, but her expression remained confused. "I don't see anything unusual, sweetie. Are you feeling all right?" The elevator reached the 8th floor and Mrs. Patterson got off, but not before giving me a concerned look that suggested she thought I might be having some kind of episode. I was left alone with the mystery button, which seemed to pulse slightly in the fluorescent light of the elevator car. When I got home, I did some research on the building's history. I learned that it had been built in 1967 and had originally been designed as a hotel before being converted to apartments in the 1980s. There had been a restaurant and bar on the 15th floor when it was a hotel, but that space had been sealed off during the conversion and was now used only for building maintenance. More disturbing was what I found in old newspaper archives. In 1978, when the building was still a hotel, a 10-year-old girl named Jennifer Walsh had disappeared from the 15th floor. She had been staying at the hotel with her family, and witnesses reported seeing her get on the elevator alone late one evening. She was found 3 days later in the sealed-off restaurant space on the 15th floor, apparently having died of dehydration and exposure. The incident had been ruled an accident, with investigators concluding that Jennifer had somehow managed to access the restricted floor and become trapped there. But some details in the newspaper reports bothered me. Several witnesses mentioned that Jennifer had been talking about an elevator game in the days before her disappearance, though none of them could explain what this game involved. I became obsessed with the mystery button and the story of Jennifer Walsh. Every time I rode the elevator, I looked for the upside-down triangle, and about once a week it would appear. But it seemed like I was the only one who could see it. Other residents would look directly at it when I pointed it out, but their eyes would just slide past as if it weren't there. I started keeping a notebook, documenting every time I saw the button and trying to figure out if there was a pattern. I noticed that it appeared most often in the evening between 7 and 9 p.m. and usually when I was alone in the elevator. I also noticed that on the days when the button was visible, strange things would happen in the building. Residents would report elevator malfunctions, being taken to the wrong floor, doors opening and closing repeatedly, or the elevator moving without anyone pressing any buttons. Some people complained of hearing sounds coming from inside the elevator shaft late at night, like footsteps or muffled voices, even when the elevator wasn't in use. Mrs. Chen from the 9th floor told me that she had been riding the elevator to the lobby when it suddenly stopped at the 5th floor. The doors opened, but instead of seeing the familiar hallway with its beige carpet and fluorescent lighting, she saw what looked like an old hotel corridor with dark wood paneling and dim lighting. She said the air that came into the elevator smelled musty and old, like a room that hadn't been opened in years. The doors had closed after a few seconds, and when they opened again at the lobby, everything was normal. Mrs. Chen assumed she had been daydreaming or maybe dozed off during the ride, but her description matched what I had read about the building's appearance when it was still a hotel in the 1970s. As my research into Jennifer Walsh continued, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In several online forums dedicated to urban legends and ghost stories, I found references to something called the elevator game. Different versions of the game were described, but they all involved riding an elevator alone and pressing buttons in a specific sequence to access hidden floors or alternate dimensions. One version of the game was specific to buildings where someone had died in or near an elevator. According to this version, if you could find the ghost button, a button that appeared only to certain people at certain times, you could access the floor where the death had occurred and potentially communicate with the spirit of the deceased. The instructions were chilling in their specificity. Ride the elevator alone between the hours of 7 and 9 p.m. And if you saw an unusual button that others couldn't see, you could press it to be taken to the between floor, a space that existed between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But the forums were full of warnings about the dangers of playing the elevator game. People reported becoming lost in impossible corridors, encountering hostile spirits or finding themselves trapped between floors with no way to call for help. Some claim to have seen the ghosts of people who had played the game and never returned. Despite these warnings, I found myself increasingly tempted to press the mystery button. It appeared to me more and more frequently, and each time I saw it, I felt a stronger compulsion to reach out and push it. It was as if something was calling to me, urging me to discover what lay beyond that unmarked door. The decision was ultimately made for me on a cold October evening. I had been at the library doing homework and was returning home around 8 p.m. The elevator was empty when I got on, and as soon as the doors closed, I saw the upside-down triangle button glowing softly in the panel. But this time was different. This time I could hear something, a faint sound that seemed to be coming from above the elevator car. It sounded like a child crying, so soft that I might have imagined it, but persistent enough that I couldn't ignore it. As the elevator rose toward the 14th floor, the crying grew slightly louder. It was definitely a little girl, and she sounded frightened and alone. The sound was coming from somewhere above us, as if someone were trapped in the elevator shaft or on a floor that didn't exist. When the elevator reached the 14th floor, I didn't get off. Instead, I stood there staring at the mystery button while the doors remained open. The crying continued, and now I could swear I heard a voice mixed in with the sobs, a young girl's voice calling for help. Before I could talk myself out of it, I reached out and pressed the upside-down triangle button. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The elevator doors slammed shut with much more force than usual, and the car began to move upward past the 14th floor. But according to the floor indicator, we were moving beyond the building itself. The numbers kept climbing past 15, past 20, past numbers that shouldn't exist. The elevator car began to shake violently, and the lights flickered on and off. The crying sound grew much louder, no longer muffled by distance, but seeming to come from inside the elevator car itself. I pressed the button for the 14th floor repeatedly, then tried the emergency stop, then the alarm. But nothing worked. The elevator continued its impossible ascent. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the elevator came to a shuddering stop. The floor indicator showed a symbol I had never seen before. Not a number, but the same upside-down triangle that had been on the mystery button. The doors opened. What I saw beyond those doors defied explanation. Instead of a hallway or mechanical room, I found myself looking into what appeared to be the restaurant from the old hotel. But it wasn't quite right. Everything was slightly faded and gray, as if I were looking at an old photograph instead of a real place. Tables and chairs were arranged throughout the space, all covered with a thick layer of dust. A bar ran along one wall with bottles of liquor that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The windows that should have offered a view of the city were completely black, as if the building were floating in empty space. But the most disturbing thing was the little girl sitting alone at a table in the center of the room. She looked to be about my age, with long brown hair and wearing a dress that seemed to be from the 1970s. She was sitting very still, staring directly at the elevator doors as if she had been waiting for me. Her face was pale and her eyes were dark and hollow, but she didn't look angry or threatening. She looked sad and terribly lonely. "Are you Jennifer?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. She nodded slowly, then raised one hand and beckoned me to come closer. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back in the elevator and find a way to return to my floor. But I also felt an overwhelming sense of pity for this child who had been trapped alone in this impossible space for so many years. I took a step out of the elevator, and immediately the temperature dropped by at least 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the air smelled stale and old, like a room that had been sealed up for decades. "I've been waiting for someone to find me," Jennifer said, her voice echoing strangely in the empty restaurant. "I've been trying to get people to press the button, but most of them can't see it. Why can you only show it to some people? I asked, taking another step closer to her table. I don't know, she said sadly. Maybe because you're the same age I was, or maybe because you're not afraid of things that other people can't see. I've been so lonely here. I looked around the ghostly restaurant, trying to understand where we were. Is this the 15th floor? The one from when the building was a hotel? Jennifer shook her head. Not exactly. It's like a copy of that place, but it's stuck between the real world and somewhere else. I got trapped here when I played the elevator game, and I can't find a way out. What happens if you try to leave? I can't, she said. And for the first time, her voice showed emotion, desperation, and fear. The elevator won't take me to any other floor. I've pressed every button, tried everything I can think of, but it always brings me back here. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. How long have you been here? I don't know. Time doesn't work the same way here. Sometimes it feels like days, sometimes like years. I just know I'm tired of being alone. I wanted to help her, but I was also starting to panic about my own situation. I turned back toward the elevator and saw that the doors were still open, showing the familiar wood-paneled car that had brought me here. But when I looked at the button panel, all of the buttons were now dark, as if the elevator had lost power. The elevator doesn't work from this side, Jennifer said, noticing my distress. That's why I can't leave. Once you come here, you have to wait for someone else to call the elevator from another floor. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. I was trapped here with Jennifer in this impossible space between floors with no way to call for help. My parents would eventually notice I was missing, but how could they possibly find me here? But, Jennifer continued, her voice becoming slightly more hopeful, I think if two people are here together, we might be able to change things. The elevator game is different when more than one person plays. She stood up from her table and walked over to the elevator. To my amazement, when she pressed the button for the first floor, it lit up. Then she pressed the second floor button and it lit up too. Soon she had all the buttons glowing except for the one with the upside-down triangle. I think if we press the buttons in the right order, we can get back to the real building, she said excitedly. But we have to do it together, and we have to do it quickly before the connection fades. I joined her in the elevator car, and together we began pressing buttons in sequence. First floor, second floor, third floor, all the way up to 14. As we pressed each button, I could feel the elevator car beginning to vibrate as if it were preparing to move. When we pressed the 14th floor button together, the doors slammed shut and the elevator began to plummet. But this wasn't the smooth descent I was used to. We were falling rapidly and the floor indicator was spinning wildly, showing numbers and symbols that flashed by too quickly to read. Jennifer grabbed my hand and I could feel how cold she was, how insubstantial, as if she were made of mist rather than flesh. But her grip was strong and she held on tightly as the elevator continued its chaotic descent. Finally, with a tremendous crash that threw us both to the floor, the elevator came to a stop. The lights flickered back on and I saw that the floor indicator showed 1, the lobby level. The button panel looked normal again with no trace of the upside-down triangle. The doors opened, revealing the familiar marble floor and fluorescent lighting of our building's lobby. I scrambled to my feet and looked around for Jennifer, but she was gone. The elevator car was empty except for me. I ran out into the lobby expecting to find concerned residents or security, guards. Surely someone must have heard the crash when the elevator stopped. But the lobby was empty and quiet, as if nothing unusual had happened. I checked the clock on the wall and was shocked to see that it was still 8:15 p.m., only 15 minutes after I had first gotten on the elevator. According to the clock, I had been gone for less than 20 minutes, though it had felt like hours. When I got back to our apartment, my parents were watching television and didn't seem concerned about my late arrival. My mom asked how the library had been, and when I told her I had just gotten back, she looked confused and said I had been home for over an hour. I went to my room and tried to process what had happened. Had it all been a dream or hallucination? But I could still smell that stale, cold air from the Impossible restaurant, and my clothes were covered with a thin layer of dust that hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, I watched the elevator carefully, but I never saw the upside-down triangle button again. The strange malfunctions that other residents had been reporting stopped as well. Mrs. Chen mentioned that the elevator seemed to be working better than it had in months. But I did notice one change. Sometimes when I rode the elevator alone, I would hear faint sounds coming from somewhere above the car. Not crying this time, but what sounded like laughter. Happy laughter, like a child playing. I never saw Jennifer again, but I like to think that by helping her figure out the elevator game, I helped her find her way to wherever she was supposed to go. The newspaper articles I had found mentioned that her body had been discovered in the sealed 15th floor, but perhaps her spirit had been trapped in that between space until someone could show her the way out. I'm 32 now, and I haven't lived in that building for over 20 years. But I still think about Jennifer Walsh and that Impossible restaurant whenever I ride in old elevators. And sometimes when I'm alone in an elevator car and I hear the cables creaking or feel the car shudder slightly between floors, I find myself checking the button panel, just to make sure there are no mysterious symbols that only I can see. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. My parents would have thought I was having psychological problems, and my friends would have assumed I was making it up for attention. But sometimes I wonder if there are other children out there who can see buttons that shouldn't exist, who hear voices calling from impossible floors. If there are, I hope they're braver than I was. I hope they don't spend weeks agonizing over whether to press the mystery button. And I hope that if they do decide to play the elevator game, they remember that sometimes the goal isn't to win. Sometimes it's just to help someone else find their way home. When I was 7 years old, my family moved into a house with a swimming pool. It was the first time we'd ever had a pool, and I was absolutely thrilled. The house itself was nice, a 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood. But what made it special was the backyard. It was large and private, surrounded by tall wooden fencing with the pool as its centerpiece. The pool was kidney-shaped and fairly deep, about 8 feet at the deepest point. It had been built in the 1960s when the house was new. And while the equipment was older, everything was in good working order when we moved in. The previous owners had left behind all the pool maintenance supplies and even some pool toys. Inflatable rafts, diving rings, and a basketball hoop that attached to the side. My parents were excited about having a pool too, though they were also nervous about the safety aspects. They immediately enrolled me in swimming lessons and installed additional safety features like a locked gate around the pool area and motion sensor lights that would turn on if anyone approached the water after dark. I learned to swim quickly that first summer, and by July I was comfortable swimming alone, with adult supervision nearby, of course. The pool became my favorite place to be. I would spend hours every day swimming laps, practicing diving, or just floating on my back looking up at the clouds. But there was something about the pool that made me uncomfortable, especially in the evenings. During the day, when the sun was shining and the water sparkled blue and inviting, everything felt perfect. But as the sun began to set and shadows started creeping across the yard, the pool took on a different character. The water would look darker, almost black in some areas, and the deep end seemed much deeper than 8 feet. Sometimes I would see shapes moving beneath the surface that were probably just shadows from the trees overhead, but they looked like something swimming just below where I could clearly see. The first really strange thing happened on a night in early August. I had been swimming until just before dinner, and afterward I was helping my dad test the water's chemical levels. We were standing at the edge of the pool with a testing kit, and the underwater lights were on, making the water glow an eerie blue-green color. As I watched my dad dip the test strips into the water, I saw something that made my stomach lurch. There was a shadow at the bottom of the deep end that looked like a person. Not a vague, could-be-anything shadow, but a clear human silhouette lying on the pool floor as if someone were down there. "Dad," I said, pointing at the deep end, "what's that?" He looked where I was pointing and shrugged. "Probably just leaves or debris. We'll need to vacuum it out tomorrow." But as I continued to stare, the shadow seemed to move slightly, shifting position as if the person were trying to get comfortable. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but now I couldn't see anything unusual at all. That night I had the first of what would become a recurring nightmare about the pool. In the dream, I was swimming alone at night when I noticed someone else in the water with me. At first I felt relieved I wasn't alone after all, but as the other swimmer got closer, I realized something was wrong. The person was swimming underwater and had been down there far too long, much longer than anyone could hold their breath. And when they finally surfaced near me, their face was pale and bloated, with dark water streaming from their mouth and nose. I woke up gasping and immediately ran to my bedroom window, which overlooked the pool. The underwater lights were on their automatic timer, and the pool glowed softly in the darkness. As I watched, I could swear I saw ripples moving across the surface, as if someone were swimming laps in the middle of the night. I told my parents about the dream and asked if anyone had ever drowned in our pool. They said they didn't know the complete history of the house, but they assured me that the pool was perfectly safe and that I shouldn't worry about scary dreams. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, especially after I started doing some research into the history of our house and neighborhood. What I found made my nightmares seem less like imagination and more like memories of something that had actually happened. In 1987, a 13-year-old boy named David Martinez had drowned in our pool. He had been at a neighborhood party while his parents were out of town, and sometime during the evening he had gone into the backyard alone. Other kids at the party said they had seen him by the pool, but no one had paid much attention to him. David's body was found the next morning by a neighbor who had come over to check on the house. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, possibly caused by hitting his head on the pool's edge or diving board. There had been alcohol at the party, and investigators concluded that David had probably been drinking and had decided to go swimming alone, which led to the accident. But there were some details in the newspaper reports that bothered me. Several witnesses mentioned that David had been acting strangely that evening, talking about seeing someone in the pool who wasn't there. One girl said he kept insisting that someone was calling to him from underwater, trying to get him to come swimming. Another troubling detail was that David had been found at the bottom of the deep end, but he was a strong swimmer who had been on his school's swim team. It seemed unlikely that he would have simply drowned in a pool he was familiar with, even if he had been drinking. After reading about David's death, my dreams about the pool became more frequent and more vivid. Almost every night I would dream about swimming and encountering the pale, bloated figure underwater. Sometimes in the dreams, the figure would speak to me, asking me to come deeper, to join him at the bottom of the pool. I started avoiding the pool in the evenings, and I refused to swim alone even during the day. My parents were concerned about the sudden change in my behavior, especially since I had been so enthusiastic about swimming just weeks before. But it wasn't just the dreams that were bothering me. I was starting to see things while I was awake too. When I looked at the pool from my bedroom window at night, I would sometimes see a figure swimming back and forth in the deep end. The underwater lights would reveal a shadow that moved like a person doing laps, but whenever my parents came to look, they never saw anything. During the day, when the sun was bright and the water was clear, I would sometimes catch glimpses of someone sitting at the bottom of the pool. It always happened in my peripheral vision. If I looked directly, there was nothing there. But in those brief moments when I wasn't looking straight at the deep end, I would see a young man with dark hair sitting cross-legged on the pool floor, looking up at the surface as if he were waiting for something. The most disturbing incident happened on a Saturday afternoon in late August. I was swimming with my friend Jake, who lived down the street. We had been playing water basketball and were taking a break, sitting on the edge of the pool with our feet in the water. Jake was telling me about his plans for the upcoming school year when I noticed something that made me stop listening entirely. There was someone else in the pool with us. At the far end, near the deep area, a young man was treading water. He looked to be a teenager with dark hair that was slicked back from his face. His skin was very pale, and he was watching us with an expression of intense longing, as if he wanted to join our game but couldn't figure out how. "Jake," I whispered, not wanting to startle the figure in the water. "Do you see him?" "See who?" Jake asked, following my gaze toward the deep end. I pointed directly at the swimmer, but Jake just looked confused. "There's nobody there, man. Are you feeling okay?" I looked back at the deep end and the figure was gone. The water was completely still, with no ripples or disturbance to indicate that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had seen, and it definitely hadn't been my imagination. That night, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I told my parents everything, about the dreams, about seeing the swimmer during the day, about David Martinez and the research I had done about his death. I expected them to dismiss my concerns or suggest that I was letting my imagination run wild, but instead they listened seriously. My mom admitted that she had been having uncomfortable feelings about the pool too, especially at night. She said she sometimes felt like someone was watching her when she went outside to check the pool lights or temperature. My dad said he had noticed that the automatic pool cleaner seemed to malfunction frequently, often getting stuck in the deep end for no apparent reason. We decided to contact a local historian who specialized in researching the backgrounds of older homes. Mrs. Kelly was a retired librarian who had been documenting neighborhood history for decades, and she was familiar with our house and the incident involving David Martinez. But what she told us was even more disturbing than what I had already learned. David Martinez hadn't been the only person to drown in our pool. In 1971, just a few years after the house was built, a 7-year-old girl named Susan Chen had drowned during a family barbecue. Her death had also been ruled accidental. She had apparently fallen into the pool while adults were busy with party preparations and hadn't been missed until it was too late. Mrs. Kelly said there had been rumors in the neighborhood that the pool was somehow unlucky, and that some previous owners had reported strange experiences, hearing splashing sounds at night when no one was using the pool, finding wet footprints on the pool deck in the morning, or seeing unexplained ripples on the water's surface. "Some people believe," Mrs. Kelly said carefully, "that when someone dies in water, especially if they're young, or if the death was sudden, their spirit can become attached to that place. They keep trying to return to the water, or they try to communicate with the living." She suggested that we might want to consider having the pool blessed or even filled in permanently. But my parents were reluctant to take such drastic action based on what might be coincidences or overactive imagination. Instead, we tried a compromise. We installed additional lighting around the pool area and put up security cameras to monitor any unusual activity. We also changed our routine so that no one ever went near the pool alone, especially at night. For a few weeks, this seemed to help. I didn't have any more dreams about the drowning victims, and I stopped seeing figures in the water during the day. The pool area felt more normal, less charged with invisible tension. But the peaceful period didn't last long. In early September, just before school started, I woke up one night to the sound of splashing outside my window. It was about 2 a.m. and there shouldn't have been anyone in the pool. I looked outside and saw someone swimming laps in the deep end. This time, I decided to wake up my parents immediately. We all went outside together, turning on all the pool lights and looking carefully at the water. The pool was completely still, with no signs that anyone had been swimming. But the security camera had captured something strange. On the video footage, we could see ripples and disturbances in the water that looked exactly like someone swimming. But there was no visible person causing the movement. The water would part and surge as if displaced by a swimmer's strokes, but the cameras showed only empty pool water. Over the following weeks, this happened several more times. We would hear splashing at night, or we would check the cameras in the morning and find footage of invisible swimmers moving through the water. Sometimes we could even hear voices, not clear enough to make out words, but definitely the sounds of people talking and laughing, as if there were a pool party happening that we couldn't see. The final incident that convinced us to take action happened in mid-September. I was getting ready for bed when I heard what sounded like someone in distress outside. It was a voice calling for help, and it seemed to be coming from the pool area. I ran downstairs and outside, thinking that maybe a neighbor's child had somehow gotten into our yard and was in trouble. But when I reached the pool, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There were two figures in the water. One was David Martinez, the teenager I had been seeing all summer, but now I could also see Susan Chen, the little girl who had drowned in 1971. They were both at the bottom of the deep end, and they were reaching upward toward the surface as if they were trying to swim up but couldn't quite make it. Both of them looked exactly as they must have looked at the moment of their deaths. Susan in a bright yellow swimsuit, David in red swim trunks. Their faces were desperate and frightened, and they seemed to be calling out, though I couldn't hear their voices clearly. I stood frozen at the edge of the pool, wanting to help them, but knowing that they weren't really there, not in any way that I could reach. After a few minutes, their images began to fade, becoming more transparent until they disappeared entirely. The next day, my parents made arrangements to have the pool drained and filled in permanently. They told the neighbors we were converting the backyard to a garden, but I knew the real reason. We couldn't live with the knowledge that 2 children had died in that water, and that their spirits were still trapped there, still trying to reach the surface, still calling for help that would never come. The process took several weeks. First, the pool was drained completely. Then contractors came to break up the concrete and fill the space with dirt. We planted grass and flowers where the pool had been, trying to transform the space into something peaceful and life-affirming instead of a monument to tragedy. I never saw David or Susan again after the pool was filled in. But sometimes on hot summer nights, I think I can still hear the faint sound of splashing water coming from our backyard. And when I visit friends who have swimming pools, I'm always careful to stay in the shallow end. And I never swim alone, especially at night. I'm 29 now and I have children of my own. We live in a house with a small above-ground pool, and my kids love swimming just as much as I did at their age. But I've taught them to be respectful around water, to understand that pools and lakes and rivers can be dangerous in ways that aren't always obvious. Sometimes my oldest daughter asks why I get nervous when she swims in the deep end, or why I insist on so many safety rules that other parents don't seem to worry about. I tell her that water deserves respect, that it's powerful and unpredictable. But I don't tell her about David Martinez and Susan Chen, or about the summer I spent watching drowned children try to swim up from the bottom of our pool. Maybe someday when she's older I'll tell her the whole story, but for now, I just make sure she knows how to swim well, and I never let her go near the water alone. Because I learned that summer that some dangers can't be seen or touched or explained, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply pay attention to the warnings that others might miss. When I was 9 years old, my family lived in a small house on Maple Street, right next to Lincoln Elementary School. Our backyard fence connected directly to the school's playground, which during the day was filled with the sounds of children laughing, playing tag, and enjoying recess. But at night, when the school was empty and dark, the playground took on a completely different character. My bedroom was on the second floor of our house, and my window had a clear view of the entire playground. During the day, I loved being able to watch the kids playing from my room. It was like having my own private view of all the neighborhood activity. But after sunset, that same window became a source of anxiety and sleepless nights. The playground equipment was typical for a 1990s elementary school: a large jungle gym with slides and monkey bars, a set of swings, a merry-go-round, a seesaw, and a sandbox. There were also basketball hoops at one end and a large field for soccer and other sports. During the day, everything looked bright and cheerful, painted in primary colors that stood out against the green grass and blue sky. But at night, silhouetted against the dark sky and illuminated only by a few scattered streetlights, the playground equipment looked somehow menacing. The jungle gym cast long, twisted shadows that looked like giant spider webs. The swings hung motionless and ghostly. The merry-go-round, when caught by a gust of wind, would turn slowly with a rusty creaking sound that carried clearly through my bedroom window. The first time I noticed something unusual was on a night in late October, just after we had moved into the house. I was lying in bed reading when I heard a sound that made me look up from my book, the rhythmic creaking of a swing in motion. I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced out the window, only one of the 6 swings was moving. It was the swing on the far left, the one with the blue seat, and it wasn't just swaying gently like it would in a breeze. It was moving back and forth in long, steady arcs, as if someone were actually sitting in it and pumping their legs to go higher. The other swings hung perfectly still, even though the wind that should have been affecting all of them equally. I watched for several minutes, fascinated and slightly unnerved. The swing continued its steady motion, never slowing down or speeding up, just maintaining that perfect rhythm that you can only achieve when you're actually trying to swing. Eventually, I got tired of watching and went to sleep, but the creaking sound continued for what felt like hours. The next morning at breakfast, I mentioned the swinging to my parents. My dad said old playground equipment sometimes moved on its own due to wind or changes in temperature, and that it was nothing to worry about. My mom suggested that maybe I should close my curtains at bedtime so I wouldn't be distracted by things happening outside. But I was curious now, and instead of closing the curtains, I started paying more attention to the playground at night. Over the next few weeks, I observed the blue swing moving on dozens of occasions. It always happened after dark, usually between 9 p.m. and midnight, and always the same steady, purposeful motion that looked exactly like someone swinging. More disturbing was that I started hearing other sounds as well. Sometimes I would hear children's voices, not clear enough to make out words, but definitely the sounds of kids talking, laughing, and calling to each other. The voices had the quality of playground chatter, the kind of happy background noise you'd expect during recess. But when I looked out the window, the playground was always empty. The swings, except for the blue one, were still. The jungle gym was deserted, and there were no signs of anyone playing. The disconnect between what I was hearing and what I was seeing made me feel cold and anxious. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, documenting every time I heard the voices or saw the swing moving. Over the course of several months, I identified patterns. The activity was most frequent on school nights, less common on weekends. It happened more often when the weather was clear, rarely during storms or heavy rain. and it always stopped completely around midnight, as if there were some kind of curfew for whatever was causing it. My parents remained skeptical when I shared my observations. They suggested that I might be hearing sounds from other neighborhoods, or that the swing might be moving due to mechanical issues with its mounting hardware. But I knew what I was seeing and hearing wasn't normal. The first time I actually saw one of the ghost children was on a cold night in February. I had been lying in bed with the flu, feeling miserable but unable to sleep, when I heard the familiar sound of the blue swing creaking. I looked out the window and saw something that made me forget all about being sick. There was a little girl sitting in the blue swing, pumping her legs and swinging back and forth exactly as I had imagined someone must be doing all those nights. She looked to be about 6 or 7 years old, with long dark hair that streamed behind her as she swung. She was wearing a white dress that seemed to glow softly in the darkness. I sat up in bed and stared, hardly believing what I was seeing. The little girl continued swinging for several minutes, and I could see her clearly each time she passed under one of the streetlights. She looked solid and real, not transparent or ghostly like spirits in movies. But there was something about her that wasn't quite right. Something about the way she moved that seemed too smooth, too perfect. As I watched, she gradually slowed her swinging and came to a stop. For a moment, she just sat there, and I had the unsettling feeling that she was looking directly at my bedroom window, as if she knew I was watching her. Then she got off the swing and walked toward the jungle gym, disappearing into the shadows. I ran downstairs and woke up my parents, insisting that they come see what was happening in the playground. By the time we got to my bedroom window, everything was back to normal. The blue swing hung motionless, and there was no sign of the little girl in the white dress. My parents were getting concerned about my preoccupation with the playground, and they made an appointment for me to see a counselor. They worried that the stress of moving to a new house and starting at a new school might be causing me to have anxiety-related hallucinations. But before my appointment, something happened that changed everything. My friend Marcus, who lived 2 streets over, came for a sleepover on a Friday night. We were in my room playing video games when we heard the sounds of children playing outside. Marcus looked up from his game controller and asked, "Are there kids playing at the school at night?" I felt a rush of relief that someone else could hear the voices. "You hear them too?" "Yeah," he said, walking over to the window. "It sounds like there's a whole group of them out there." We both looked out at the playground, and what we saw made Marcus grab my arm in shock. There weren't just 1 or 2 ghost children. There were dozens of them. The entire playground was full of kids who appeared to be having the time of their lives. There were children on every piece of equipment. The swings were all occupied, with kids pumping their legs and calling out to their friends. Several children were climbing on the jungle gym, sliding down the slides and hanging from the monkey bars. A group was playing on the merry-go-round, laughing as it spun faster and faster. Others were running around the field, playing what looked like an elaborate game of tag. All of the children appeared to be elementary school age, and they were dressed in clothing from different eras. Some wore modern jeans and t-shirts, while others had on dresses and outfits that looked like they were from the 1950s or 60s. A few children were dressed in what appeared to be clothing from even earlier decades: old-fashioned knickers, suspender shorts, and dresses with high collars. Despite the variety in their clothing, all of the children had the same ethereal quality I had noticed in the little girl with the white dress. They moved with that too smooth perfection, and they all seemed to glow faintly in the darkness as if they were lit from within. Marcus and I watched in fascinated silence for nearly an hour. The ghost children played with boundless energy and obvious joy, never seeming to tire or slow down. They played games that looked familiar: tag, hide and seek, Red Rover. but they also engaged in activities that seemed strange and outdated. Games I didn't recognize but that had the rhythm and structure of organized play. What struck me most was how normal it all looked, despite the supernatural nature of what we were witnessing. These children were simply playing, the way kids have always played on playgrounds. There was nothing menacing or frightening about their behavior. They were just enjoying themselves in the way children do when they have unlimited demon space to play. "Who do you think they are?" Marcus whispered, as if speaking too loudly might cause them to disappear. "I think they're kids who used to go to the school," I whispered back. "Maybe kids who died, or maybe just kids who loved playing here so much that part of them stayed behind." As if they had heard us talking, several of the ghost children looked up toward my bedroom window. They didn't seem alarmed or upset to see us watching. Instead, they waved cheerfully, as if inviting us to come down and join their eternal recess. Marcus waved back instinctively, and I found myself doing the same. The children on the playground responded with enthusiastic waves and gestures that seemed to say, "Come play with us." But something about the invitation made me feel uneasy, even though the children themselves seemed friendly and harmless. We continued watching until nearly midnight, when something remarkable happened. One by one, the ghost children began to fade away, becoming more and more transparent until they disappeared entirely. They didn't all vanish at once. Instead, they seemed to be finishing up their games and gradually departing, as if it were time to go home. The little girl in the white dress, who I now thought of as the first ghost child I had seen, was the last to leave. She had been swinging on the blue swing again, and as the other children faded away, she slowed her swinging and came to a stop. She sat there for a moment, looking up at our window, and then she too became transparent and disappeared. The playground was suddenly empty and silent, looking exactly as it did during normal nighttime hours. The only evidence of what we had witnessed was the blue swing, which continued to rock gently back and forth for several minutes after its ghostly occupant had vanished. Marcus spent the rest of the night asking me questions about what we had seen. Had I witnessed this before? How long had it been going on? Did I think the ghost children were trapped, or were they there by choice? I shared everything I had observed over the previous months, and we speculated about who the children might have been and why they continued to play at the school long after their deaths. The next morning, Marcus was excited to tell his parents about our supernatural encounter, but when he did, they reacted with skepticism and concern. They called my parents to discuss whether the boys were making up stories or possibly experimenting with drugs or alcohol. This led to an uncomfortable family meeting where I was asked to explain what Marcus and I claimed to have seen. I told the truth as clearly and calmly as I could, but I could see from my parents' expressions that they were more convinced than ever that I needed professional help. However, something interesting happened during that conversation. When I described the little girl in the white dress and mentioned that she appeared to be from an earlier era, my mom's expression changed. She asked me to describe the child in more detail, and when I did, she got very quiet. After Marcus went home, my mom sat me down for a private conversation. She told me that my description of the little girl matched someone she had heard about from neighbors. A child named Sarah who had died in an accident at the school playground in the 1960s, long before it was Lincoln Elementary. According to the story my mom had heard, the land where our house and the school now stood had been home to a different school building decades earlier. Sarah had been a student there, and she had died when she fell from a piece of playground equipment during recess. The old school had eventually been torn down and replaced with the current Lincoln Elementary, but the playground had remained in approximately the same location. My mom said that over the years, several neighbors had mentioned seeing a little girl in old-fashioned clothing playing alone on the playground at night. Most people dismissed these sightings as tricks of light or imagination. but there had been enough reports that it had become a kind of local legend. This information gave me a new perspective on what I had been witnessing. These weren't just random ghost children. They were former students of the schools that had existed on this land over the decades. They were children who had loved recess and playing with their friends so much that death itself couldn't separate them from the playground. Armed with this new understanding, I began researching the history of our neighborhood and the schools that had existed there. What I discovered was both fascinating and heartbreaking. The current Lincoln Elementary had been built in 1975, but there had been schools on or near this location since the early 1900s. Over the decades, several children associated with these schools had died in various accidents. Not just Sarah, but others who had been hit by cars while walking to school, who had succumbed to childhood illnesses, or who had died in household accidents. Some had been students, others had been siblings or neighbors who played at the school during off hours. It seemed that all of these children, bound together by their connection to this place and their love of playing, continued to gather here at night for an eternal recess that death couldn't interrupt. Understanding the history behind the ghost children made me feel less frightened and more sympathetic toward them. They weren't trying to harm anyone or cause trouble. They were simply continuing to do what they had always loved to do. In a way, it was beautiful rather than scary, but my newfound acceptance of the situation was tested when the ghost children began trying to communicate with me more directly. It started with small things. Toys left in specific arrangements on the playground equipment that spelled out letters or simple words. Sometimes I would find drawings made in the sand of the sandbox, pictures of stick figures holding hands or playing games. The messages were always friendly and innocent. Hello, play with us, come outside. But they made me realize that the ghost children were aware of me as an individual, not just as a random observer. They knew I could see them, and they wanted me to interact with them more directly. The situation escalated one night in early spring when I heard a sound I had never heard before, someone knocking on my bedroom window. I looked outside and saw Sarah, the little girl in the white dress, floating in the air outside my second-story window. She was smiling and gesturing for me to open the window, as if she wanted to talk to me face to face. I felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. Even though Sarah looked friendly and harmless, there was something deeply unnatural about a dead child floating outside my bedroom window in the middle of the night. I pretended to be asleep and refused to acknowledge her presence, and eventually she floated away. But the next night, she was back, this time accompanied by 2 other ghost children. They hovered outside my window, tapping on the glass and calling my name in voices that sounded like wind chimes. I could see their mouths moving, and I could hear them faintly through the glass. But I kept my eyes closed and my blankets pulled over my head. This continued for several more nights, with increasing numbers of ghost children gathering outside my window each time. They never seemed angry or threatening, but they were becoming more insistent in their attempts to get my attention. Sometimes they would tap on the window for hours, and I could hear them calling my name and asking me to come outside and play. I was losing sleep and becoming increasingly anxious about going to bed each night. My parents noticed that I was tired and irritable, and they renewed their push for me to see a counselor about my playground obsession. The situation came to a head on a Saturday night in April. I had been lying awake for hours listening to the ghost children gathering outside my window when I heard a new sound, footsteps in our house. Slow, careful footsteps coming up the stairs toward my bedroom. I knew it couldn't be my parents because they were both snoring in their bedroom at the other end of the hall. The footsteps were too light to be an adult anyway. They sounded like a child walking barefoot on the hardwood floors. My bedroom door, which I always kept closed at night, began to creak open slowly. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see Sarah standing in my doorway. She was no longer floating or glowing. She looked solid and real, just like a living child. "Please come play with us," she said in a voice that was sweet and sad. "We've been waiting so long for someone who can see us. We just want to have friends again." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm alive and you're not. It wouldn't be safe." Sarah tilted her head, considering this. "We won't hurt you," she said. "We just want to play. We remember how much fun it was to have friends and we miss it." "But what would happen to me if I came to play with you?" I asked. "Would I be able to come back home?" Sarah's expression became uncertain. I don't know," she admitted. "We've never had a living friend before, but we would take care of you. We would make sure you had fun forever." The way she said forever made my blood turn cold. I realized that Sarah and the other ghost children didn't fully understand the difference between life and death, or the implications of what they were asking me to do. In their innocent desire for companionship, they might accidentally trap me in their supernatural playground, making me a permanent part of their eternal races. "I can't come with you, Sarah," I said as gently as I could, "but I'm honored that you want to be my friend. Maybe there's another way we can be friends without me having to leave my family." Sarah looked disappointed but not angry. "What do you mean?" "Maybe I could wave to you from my window sometimes or leave you drawings that you could find on the playground. We could be friends, but I would stay where I belong and you could stay where you belong." Sarah considered this proposal seriously. After a long moment, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "That would be nice too." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Will you always remember us?" she asked. "Always," I promised, and I meant it. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since I had been seeing the ghost children, her smile looked completely natural and happy rather than supernaturally perfect. She waved goodbye and walked back down the hallway, her footsteps fading as she disappeared. After that night, my relationship with the ghost children changed completely. They no longer tried to get me to join them or tapped on my window. Instead, we developed a system of friendly communication that respected the boundary between life and death. I would wave to them from my window when I saw them playing, and they would wave back enthusiastically. Sometimes I would leave drawings or notes for them on the playground equipment, and they would leave messages for me in return. We never spoke face to face again, but we maintained a genuine friendship across the divide between the living and the dead. The ghost children continued to play at the school every night, and I continued to watch them sometimes when I couldn't sleep. But now, instead of feeling frightened or anxious, I felt comforted by their presence. They were keeping the playground alive with the sound of children's laughter, ensuring that the joy and innocence of childhood would never completely disappear from that place. When my family moved away 3 years later, saying goodbye to the ghost children was one of the hardest parts of leaving. On my last night in the house, I sat at my bedroom window and watched them play for hours. When midnight came and they began to fade away, Sarah appeared one last time at my window. She pressed her hand against the glass and I pressed mine against the other side. For just a moment, it felt like we were really touching. Two friends saying goodbye across an impossible divide. "Thank you for being our friend," she whispered, and then she was gone. I'm 31 now, and I have 2 children of my own. We live in a different city, but sometimes when we drive past elementary schools with playgrounds, I find myself looking for signs of ghost children. I've never seen any others as clearly as I saw Sarah and her friends, but occasionally I'll catch a glimpse of movement that seems too purposeful to be wind. Or hear laughter that sounds just a little too ethereal to be completely human. My children love playgrounds, and they play with the same boundless energy and joy that I remember from the ghost children. Watching them swing and climb and run around with their friends, I'm reminded that the urge to play is one of the most fundamental and beautiful aspects of childhood. Sometimes my youngest daughter will ask me why I seem sad when we're at playgrounds, and I tell her that I'm not sad. I'm just remembering other children who loved to play, children who cared so much about friendship and fun that they found a way to keep playing, even after death. I hope that Sarah and the other ghost children are still at that playground, still enjoying their eternal wreaths under the stars. And I hope that somewhere, there's another child looking out their bedroom window, feeling frightened at first, but then comforted, to discover that the joy of childhood can transcend even death itself. Because that's what I learned from my friendship with the ghost children, that love and innocence and the simple desire to play and have friends are forces so powerful that not even death can completely extinguish them. They live on in the laughter of children on playgrounds everywhere, in the memories of adults who still remember what it felt like to be young and carefree, and sometimes in the spirits of those who loved childhood so much they found a way to make it last forever.